You are standing in the courtyard of an opulent Athenian villa in 420 BCE. The marble gleams white under the Mediterranean sun, and the sound of a lyre drifts through the colonnade. But as you move deeper into the house, past the public rooms where philosophers debate and merchants conduct business, you enter a private wing where the atmosphere grows heavy with secrets. Here, in chambers decorated with erotic frescoes that would make modern viewers blush, you witness a scene that ancient Greek society preferred to keep hidden from public discourse. A young man, perhaps 16, kneels silently beside a symposium couch. His beauty is striking, the kind that inspired sculptors and poets. But his eyes hold a haunting emptiness. He pours wine with practiced grace, his movements choreographed by years of training and submission. This is not a servant. This is not a slave performing household duties. This young man occupies a liminal space in Greek society that historians have long struggled to define. He is a male concubine, existing in a shadowy world between slavery and freedom, between childhood and adulthood, between desire and exploitation. That young man represents thousands who lived and died in silence behind the marble walls of ancient Greece, their stories erased by a civilization that celebrated their bodies while denying their humanity. Today, we're going to uncover the forgotten reality of male concubinage in ancient Greece, a practice that reveals the dark underbelly of a society we often idealize for its contributions to democracy, philosophy, and art. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the tragedy of male concubinage in ancient Greece, we must first examine the complex cultural framework that made such exploitation not only possible but socially acceptable. Ancient Greek society operated under a rigid system of power dynamics that categorized individuals not simply by their wealth or birth, but by their position in relationships of dominance and submission. The Greeks distinguished between the erastes, the older dominant partner, and the eromenos, the younger submissive partner. This wasn't merely a romantic distinction. It was a fundamental organizing principle of Greek social life that determined everything from legal rights to social mobility. The erastes was expected to be a mature citizen, typically over 30, who possessed both the economic means and social standing to maintain a household. The eromenos, by contrast, was young, beautiful, and crucially, dependent. But within this already problematic system lay an even darker reality. The existence of males who weren't temporary participants in these relationships during their youth, but permanent fixtures, men who never transitioned to the role of erastes, who remained trapped in positions of sexual and social subordination throughout their lives. These were the true male concubines of ancient Greece, and their existence reveals a systematic dehumanization that underpinned Greek sexual culture. The legal framework of ancient Greece provided no protection for these individuals. Unlike wives, who possessed certain legal rights and protections under marriage law, and unlike citizen children, who would eventually inherit political and social privileges. Male concubines existed in a legal void. They were property, but not quite slaves in the traditional sense. They were sexual partners, but not wives with legal standing. They were companions, but not friends with agency or choice. This legal ambiguity was not accidental. It was purposeful. It allowed wealthy Greek men to maintain stable, long-term sexual relationships with young males without the complications of marriage law or the expense of slave ownership. A male concubine could be discarded without divorce proceedings, replaced without property settlements, and abused without legal recourse. They existed in a carefully constructed blind spot of Greek jurisprudence, invisible to the law, and therefore vulnerable to every form of exploitation. The path to male concubinage in ancient Greece rarely began with choice. Most of these young men entered this life through one of several tragic circumstances, each representing a different phase of systematic vulnerability in the ancient world. War was perhaps the most common gateway to concubinage. When Greek city-states conquered their enemies, the spoils of victory included not just gold and territory, but human beings. While adult male prisoners were typically executed or sold into hard labor, and women were distributed as household slaves or wives, beautiful young men occupied a special category. They were valuable precisely because of their youth and attractiveness, qualities that made them perfect candidates for sexual exploitation. Consider the fate of Alexios, a fictional but representative figure whose story echoes through countless historical accounts. Born into a prosperous family in Thebes, Alexios lived the comfortable life of a citizen's son until the Athenian siege of 421 BCE. When the city fell, 15-year-old Alexios watched his father die defending the walls and his mother disappear into the chaos of conquest. Beautiful, young, and suddenly alone, he was selected not for the slave markets, but for something far more specific and degrading. An Athenian general named Cleomenes claimed Alexios as part of his personal spoils. But this wasn't slavery in the traditional sense. Alexios wasn't sent to work in mines or fields. Instead, he was taken to Athens and installed in a private wing of Cleomenes' house, where his role was singular and devastating: to provide sexual pleasure and aesthetic companionship to his captor. The psychological trauma of this transition cannot be overstated. In a matter of weeks, Alexios went from being a free citizen with prospects of political participation and family life to being a sexual object whose primary value lay in his ability to please a man who had destroyed his world. The Greeks had a word for this kind of systematic dehumanization: hubris. But they applied it only when citizens were the victims, never when the victims existed outside the boundaries of their moral community. Poverty provided another pathway to concubinage, though one that Greek society preferred to wrap in the language of patronage and education. Families facing economic ruin might entrust a beautiful son to a wealthy man, ostensibly for education and advancement. The boy would live in the patron's household, receive tutoring in music and literature, and learn the social graces necessary for elite society. In exchange, he would provide sexual services and aesthetic pleasure to his benefactor. This arrangement was presented as mutually beneficial. The family escaped poverty, the boy received education, and the patron gained a cultured companion. But the reality was far more sinister. These boys, some as young as 12 or 13, had no legal recourse if their patron proved abusive. They couldn't leave without forfeiting their education and often their family's economic stability. They were trapped by circumstances that Greek society had carefully constructed to appear voluntary while being fundamentally coercive. The case of Dionysios illustrates this dynamic perfectly. Born to a once wealthy family that had lost its fortune through bad investments, 13-year-old Dionysios was gifted to Pheidippides, a wealthy pottery manufacturer, ostensibly to learn the trade and mathematics. For 3 years, Dionysios did indeed receive education. He learned to read and write, to play the lyre, and to recite poetry. But he also learned to endure nightly visits to his patron's chambers, to accept sexual demands without protest, and to smile graciously at symposiums where he served wine to men who viewed him as entertainment. When Dionysios turned 16 and his beauty began to fade from boyish to mature, Pheidippides lost interest. But rather than freeing his former favorite, he sold Dionysios to another wealthy Athenian, this time explicitly as a concubine rather than a student. Dionysios had received his education, but the price was his autonomy, his dignity, and ultimately his future. He would spend the rest of his life moving from household to household, aging out of desirability in one place only to be passed to the next, never gaining the independence or citizenship rights that should have been his birthright. The day-to-day existence of male concubines in ancient Greece was a carefully orchestrated performance of submission and desire, designed to fulfill their owners' fantasies while systematically stripping away their humanity. These young men lived in a state of perpetual readiness, always available, always beautiful, always compliant. Morning routines began before dawn, with elaborate preparations for physical presentation. Male concubines were expected to maintain standards of grooming and beauty that rivaled those of the most pampered women in Greek society. They would oil their skin, arrange their hair in styles that emphasized their youthful features, and sometimes apply cosmetics to enhance their natural beauty. This wasn't vanity, it was survival. A concubine whose appearance disappointed his master risked punishment, replacement, or sale to a less affluent household where conditions might be even more degrading. The psychological toll of this daily preparation cannot be understated. Imagine the internal experience of a young man, perhaps 17 or 18, standing before a polished bronze mirror each morning, knowing that his continued shelter and safety depended entirely on his ability to inspire desire in a man who owned him. The mirror reflected not just his face, but his complete powerlessness, his recognition that his body was not his own, that his youth was being consumed for another's pleasure, that his future held nothing but the inevitable decay of the very qualities that kept him alive. Daytime hours were often spent in education and cultural refinement, but this learning served the master's pleasure rather than the concubine's development. A male concubine might learn to play complex musical pieces, but only those that pleased his owner's ears. He might study poetry, but only to recite verses that enhanced the atmosphere of private dinners. He might learn philosophy, but only enough to provide intelligent conversation during intimate moments, never enough to develop independent critical thinking that might threaten his submission. This education was perhaps the cruelest aspect of concubinage, because it dangled the possibility of intellectual fulfillment while ensuring it could never be fully achieved. These young men were kept intelligent enough to be interesting companions, but never educated enough to envision alternatives to their circumstances. They learned just enough about the wider world to understand what they were missing, but never enough to access it. Evenings brought the most explicitly degrading aspects of concubinage. Male concubines were expected to serve at symposiums, the drinking parties that were central to Greek social and political life. But their role went far beyond serving wine or providing entertainment. They were living decoration, human ornaments that demonstrated their owner's wealth and refined taste. Guests at these parties understood that the beautiful young men pouring their wine were available for more than conversation, and concubines were expected to endure groping, crude comments, and sometimes more explicit sexual demands from multiple men in a single evening. The symposium was where the fiction of Greek civilization's nobility was most starkly contradicted by its reality. These were gatherings where philosophers discussed virtue and justice while sexually objectifying teenagers, where politicians debated the principles of democracy while ignoring the complete powerlessness of the young men serving them, where poets crafted verses about honor and beauty while treating human beings as consumable aesthetic objects. For the concubines themselves, symposiums were exercises in dissociation and survival. They learned to smile while being humiliated, to appear engaged while protecting their psychological core from the degradation surrounding them. Many developed what we would now recognize as complex trauma responses, an ability to mentally disconnect from their physical experience that allowed them to endure but left them psychologically fragmented. The night hours brought the most intimate violations. Male concubines were expected to share their master's bed whenever summoned, regardless of their own desires, health, or emotional state. This wasn't the romanticized pederasty that some modern scholars have attempted to describe. It was systematic sexual exploitation of young men who had no right to refuse and no recourse if they were hurt or mistreated. The psychological impact of this nightly violation compounded over months and years. These young men learned to divorce their sense of self from their physical experience, to exist in a state of psychological exile from their own bodies. They developed survival mechanisms that allowed them to endure, but at the cost of their capacity for authentic intimacy, genuine desire, and emotional wholeness. The mental and emotional toll of male concubinage in ancient Greece created a specific form of psychological damage that ancient society had no vocabulary to describe and no interest in addressing. These young men lived in a state of chronic trauma that modern psychology would recognize as complex PTSD, but which Greek culture simply accepted as the natural consequence of their social position. The trauma began with the initial loss of agency and identity, whether captured in war, sold by impoverished families, or tricked into arrangements they couldn't escape. These young men experienced what psychologists now call moral injury, the deep psychological wound that occurs when someone is forced to participate in or endure acts that violate their fundamental sense of right and wrong. For male concubines, this moral injury was not a single event but a daily reality that eroded their sense of self-worth and human dignity. Hypervigilance was a common survival mechanism. Male concubines learn to read their master's moods with microscopic precision, detecting the smallest signs of displeasure or desire. This constant state of alertness was exhausting, but it was also essential for survival. A concubine who failed to anticipate his master's needs might face punishment, while one who could perfectly predict and fulfill those needs might earn small privileges or protections. This hypervigilance extended to all social situations. At symposiums, concubines learned to navigate the complex dynamics between multiple powerful men, understanding instinctively which guests could be safely refused and which had to be accommodated regardless of personal cost. They developed an almost supernatural ability to read social hierarchies and power structures, skills that were necessary for survival, but came at the cost of their ability to experience genuine, unguarded human connection. Emotional numbing was another common response to the chronic trauma of concubinage. Many of these young men learned to disconnect from their emotional responses to avoid the overwhelming pain of their circumstances. They might feel nothing during sexual encounters, experience no joy in music or poetry despite their education in these arts, and maintain emotional distance even from other concubines who might have provided mutual support. This numbing was a protective mechanism, but it came with devastating consequences. These young men lost the ability to experience pleasure, joy, or authentic connection. They became expert performers of emotion, able to simulate desire, happiness, or engagement when required. But internally, they existed in a state of emotional void that protected them from pain, but also cut them off from any possibility of genuine fulfillment. Some concubines developed what we might now recognize as dissociative disorders, learning to mentally separate from their physical experience during moments of violation or degradation. They might describe feeling as though they were watching their own lives from outside their bodies, present but not present, participating but not experiencing. This psychological strategy allowed them to endure experiences that would have otherwise been unbearable, but it also left them fragmented and disconnected from their own identity. The absence of hope was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of male concubinage. Unlike slaves who might earn or purchase their freedom, or apprentices who would eventually complete their training, male concubines existed in a system with no clear endpoint. Their value was tied to their youth and beauty, qualities that inevitably faded with time. As they aged, they faced not freedom, but obsolescence, the prospect of being discarded for younger replacements with no resources, skills, or social connections to build independent lives. This hopelessness created a unique form of despair that permeated every aspect of these young men's existence. They couldn't plan for the future because they had no future to plan for. They couldn't form meaningful relationships because their human connections were mediated by their status as property. They couldn't develop authentic interests or ambitions because their lives were entirely devoted to fulfilling others' desires. Yet, remarkably, many male concubines found ways to preserve some core of human dignity despite these overwhelming circumstances. Some formed clandestine friendships with other concubines, creating small communities of mutual support within the larger system of exploitation. Others found meaning in their cultural education, genuinely appreciating music or poetry, even while being forced to perform it for others' pleasure. Still others maintained hope through religious beliefs or philosophical insights that allowed them to see beyond their immediate circumstances. These survival strategies were acts of profound courage and resilience. To maintain any sense of human dignity while being systematically dehumanized required extraordinary psychological strength. The fact that many concubines found ways to preserve their essential humanity despite circumstances designed to destroy it testifies to the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of systematic oppression. The institution of male concubinage in ancient Greece didn't survive for centuries through accident or oversight. It was maintained through a sophisticated system of social, legal, and cultural mechanisms designed to normalize and perpetuate the exploitation of vulnerable young men. Understanding these mechanisms reveals how entire societies can become complicit in systematic abuse while maintaining their moral self-image. Legal invisibility was the foundation of this system. Male concubines existed in a carefully constructed gap in Greek law where their status was undefined and therefore unprotected. They were not citizens, so laws protecting citizen rights didn't apply to them. They were not slaves in the traditional sense, so slave protection laws were irrelevant. They were not wives, so marriage laws offered no recourse. This legal void was not accidental. It was purposefully maintained because it allowed wealthy men to exploit young males without the legal complications that would arise from more clearly defined relationships. The genius of this legal invisibility was that it made abuse nearly impossible to prosecute even when it was witnessed. How could someone bring charges for the mistreatment of a person who legally didn't exist? How could a court address violations of rights that were never recognized? This legal framework ensured that no matter how badly a concubine was treated, the system itself could not be challenged through legal channels. Cultural normalization played an equally important role in maintaining the system. Greek society developed elaborate intellectual frameworks that presented the exploitation of young men as beneficial to all parties involved. The older man was providing education, cultural refinement, and social advancement. The young man was receiving valuable training and protection. The relationship was framed as mutually beneficial, even noble, rather than exploitative. This cultural narrative was reinforced through art, literature, and philosophy. Greek pottery depicted beautiful young men in symposium scenes that romanticized their subjugation. Greek literature celebrated the aesthetic and intellectual qualities of male youths without acknowledging their lack of agency. Greek philosophy developed complex theories about love and beauty that provided intellectual cover for systematic sexual exploitation. Perhaps most insidiously, this cultural framework taught society to see male concubines not as human beings with their own desires and rights, but as aesthetic objects whose primary value lay in their ability to inspire and fulfill desire in others. They were living artworks, human embodiments of beauty and grace, rather than individuals with their own hopes, fears, and ambitions. Economic incentives created powerful motivations for maintaining the system at multiple social levels. For wealthy men, male concubines provided sexual pleasure, social status, and aesthetic satisfaction at a relatively low cost. Unlike wives, they required no dowry or property settlement. Unlike slaves, they required no significant initial investment. unlike professional entertainers, they were available exclusively and continuously. For poor families, the concubinage system offered a cruel form of economic relief. Selling or lending a beautiful son to a wealthy patron could provide immediate financial benefits and potentially long-term security for the family. This economic pressure meant that families themselves became complicit in the exploitation of their own children, creating a steady supply of young men for the system. For society as a whole, the concubinage system served important social functions that made it resistant to reform. It provided an outlet for sexual desires that might otherwise disrupt marriage patterns or social stability. It reinforced class hierarchies by allowing the wealthy to demonstrate their status through the possession of beautiful young men. It channeled potentially disruptive male sexuality into controlled, private arrangements that posed no threat to public order. Religious and philosophical justification provided the final layer of protection for the concubinage system. Greek religious practices included rituals that celebrated male beauty and youthful sexuality, creating a sacred context for relationships that were fundamentally exploitative. Greek philosophy developed theories about the educational and spiritual benefits of relationships between older and younger men, providing intellectual justification for arrangements that were primarily about sexual access and social control. These religious and philosophical frameworks were particularly effective because they appealed to Greeks' self-image as a culturally sophisticated and morally refined society. The systematic exploitation of young men could be presented not as abuse, but as a highest form of love and education. This intellectual and spiritual cover made it almost impossible for Greeks to recognize the fundamental immorality of their practices, because they had convinced themselves that these relationships were actually noble and beneficial. One of the most tragic aspects of male concubinage in ancient Greece is the almost complete absence of first-person accounts from the young men who lived this experience. Unlike other marginalized groups in the ancient world, slaves who sometimes gained freedom and wrote about their experiences, or women who occasionally left behind letters or inscriptions, male concubines lived and died in silence, their voices systematically erased by a society that had no interest in hearing their perspectives. This silence was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate policies and cultural practices designed to ensure that concubines could never develop the literacy, social connections, or economic independence necessary to record their experiences. While they might receive education in music, poetry, and other cultural arts, they were rarely taught to write in ways that would allow them to document their own lives. Their education was always filtered through their master's interests and never included the critical thinking skills that might lead them to question their circumstances. The few glimpses we have of concubines' inner lives come from indirect sources: comments in letters between wealthy men, descriptions in legal documents, or brief mentions in historical accounts. These fragments reveal young men struggling with depression, despair, and suicidal thoughts. But they are always mediated through the perspectives of their owners or observers, rather than speaking directly in their own voices. Consider this fragment from a letter written by an Athenian merchant to his brother. Young Nicias has become melancholy again, refusing food and spending his days staring at the garden wall. I fear I may need to replace him soon, as his sadness affects the mood of my symposiums. This brief mention offers a heartbreaking glimpse into the psychological state of a concubine, but it's filtered through the merchant's concern for his own entertainment rather than any genuine empathy for Nikias's suffering. Another fragment from a legal document settling an estate dispute mentions the boy Alexandros, who threw himself from the roof rather than be transferred to my client's household. This stark reference to suicide reveals the desperation that some concubines felt when faced with the prospect of being passed from one owner to another. But it provides no insight into Alexandros's thoughts, feelings, or experiences leading up to his final act. These fragments are haunting precisely because they reveal the humanity of these young men while simultaneously demonstrating how completely their voices were suppressed. We catch glimpses of real people. Nikias with his melancholy, Alexandros with his desperation. But we can never hear them speak for themselves about their experiences, their dreams, their fears, or their hopes. The systematic silencing of concubines served multiple purposes for Greek society. It prevented the development of narratives that might challenge the cultural framework supporting concubinage. It ensured that the exploitation could continue without society having to confront the human cost of their practices. Most importantly, it allowed Greeks to maintain their idealized vision of these relationships without having to acknowledge the trauma and suffering they created. This silence also served psychological functions for the concubines themselves. In a system where expressing dissatisfaction or unhappiness could result in punishment or abandonment, many learned that survival depended on maintaining a facade of contentment. They became expert at performing satisfaction while hiding their true feelings, not just from their masters, but sometimes from themselves. The absence of concubine voices in the historical record represents one of history's great tragedies of lost perspective. These young men lived at the heart of Greek cultural and intellectual life, witnessing philosophical discussions, political debates, and artistic creations from a unique vantage point. Their insights into Greek society, filtered through their experiences of exploitation and marginalization, might have provided invaluable perspectives on the contradictions and hypocrisies of Greek civilization. Instead, we are left with a historical record that documents the intellectual and artistic achievements of the Greek culture while remaining almost completely silent about the human cost of those achievements. We can read Plato's philosophical discussions about love and beauty, but we cannot hear from the young men who were objectified and exploited in the name of those same ideals. We can admire Greek pottery depicting beautiful symposium scenes, but we cannot access the experiences of the young men who served at those gatherings. This historical silence continues to impact how we understand and interpret ancient Greek culture today. Without the voices of concubines, it becomes easier to romanticize Greek pederasty and male-male relationships, to focus on their supposedly educational or spiritual aspects while ignoring their exploitative reality. The absence of first-person accounts from concubines allows modern scholars and popular culture to project idealized interpretations onto these relationships rather than confronting their fundamentally abusive nature. Perhaps no aspect of male concubinage in ancient Greece was more cruel than the inevitable obsolescence that came with aging. Unlike other forms of relationships or social arrangements, concubinage was explicitly tied to physical youth and beauty, qualities that time inevitably eroded. As male concubines aged, they faced not just the loss of their master's affection, but the complete destruction of their social and economic foundation, with no prospects for building independent lives. The transition typically began in a concubine's early 20s, when the first signs of physical maturity started to alter his boyish appearance. The smooth skin might develop the first hint of roughness, the voice might deepen slightly, or facial hair might require more frequent shaving. These minute changes, barely noticeable to most people, were catastrophic for concubines, because their entire worth was tied to maintaining an adolescent aesthetic that was, by definition, temporary. Masters typically began withdrawing their affection and attention gradually, a process that was psychologically devastating for young men who had spent years learning to find their only validation through their owner's desire. The master might invite the concubine to fewer private dinners, require his presence at fewer symposiums, or begin spending time with other younger companions. For the concubine, this gradual abandonment was a form of slow-motion rejection that confirmed his deepest fears about his worthlessness as a human being. Some masters attempted to transition aging concubines into other household roles, perhaps as personal servants, tutors for younger concubines, or managers of domestic affairs. While these arrangements provided continued shelter and security, they were often more psychologically difficult than outright dismissal. Former concubines had to witness their replacements receiving the attention and affection they had once enjoyed, while being reduced to facilitating the same system that had exploited them. The case of Demetrios illustrates this tragic transition. After serving as concubine to a wealthy Athenian politician for 8 years, 24-year-old Demetrios found himself gradually displaced by a new 15-year-old favorite. Rather than being dismissed entirely, he was retained as a household manager and given responsibility for training the new concubine. Demetrios had to teach his replacement the same submission techniques he had learned, the same strategies for pleasing their shared master, the same performance of desire and satisfaction that had defined his own adolescence and early adulthood. The psychological torture of this arrangement was exquisite. Demetrios remained in the same household where he had been exploited, but now as a facilitator of others' exploitation. He retained some security and status, but only by becoming complicit in perpetuating the system that had damaged him. He had to watch his master lavish attention on his replacement while remembering when he had received that same attention. Understanding now how temporary and conditional it had always been. Other masters simply sold their aging concubines to less wealthy households, where they might serve as concubines to men of lower social status, or be put to work in more explicitly degrading roles. This transition was often experienced as a form of social death, as former concubines found themselves falling down the social hierarchy with no ability to arrest their decline. The most fortunate aging concubines were those whose masters had developed genuine affection for them and provided some form of economic independence, perhaps a small shop or craft training that would allow them to support themselves. But these arrangements were rare and entirely dependent on their former master's generosity. Most concubines had no legal right to property or support, regardless of how many years they had served or how much pleasure they had provided. The psychological impact of aging out of concubinage was often catastrophic. These young men had spent their formative years learning that their worth was entirely tied to their physical appeal and their ability to please others sexually. They had been denied opportunities to develop independent skills, genuine relationships, or autonomous identities. When their beauty faded, they faced not just economic insecurity but a complete crisis of self-worth. Many former concubines struggled with what we would now recognize as severe depression and identity disorders. They had been trained to find validation only through others' desire, but they no longer inspired desire. They had been educated in cultural arts, but only for others' entertainment rather than their own development. They had learned to perform emotions and relationships, but had been denied opportunities to experience authentic connection. Suicide was tragically common among aging concubines who saw no future for themselves in a society that had used and discarded them. Others turned to alcohol or other forms of self-medication to numb the pain of their circumstances. Still others disappeared into the urban underclass, surviving through prostitution, petty crime, or begging, invisible and forgotten by the same society that had once prized their beauty. The fate of aging concubines reveals the ultimate cruelty of the entire system. These young men were not just exploited during their years of service. They were systematically prevented from developing the skills, relationships, and resources that would allow them to build meaningful lives after their exploitation ended. The system consumed their youth and beauty while ensuring they would have nothing to fall back on when those qualities disappeared. The institution of male concubinage in ancient Greece had profound effects that extended far beyond the individual tragedies of the young men who were directly exploited. Like a stone thrown into still water, the practice created ripple effects that influenced family structures, social relationships, cultural values, and even the political organization of Greek society in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. One of the most significant impacts was on marriage and family formation among the Greek elite. Wealthy men who maintained male concubines often delayed marriage or approached it with different expectations than men in societies without institutionalized concubinage. Why rush into the economic and social complications of marriage when sexual and aesthetic needs could be met through arrangements that offered more control and fewer obligations? This dynamic created a peculiar form of marital dysfunction in Greek society. When wealthy men eventually married, they often continued to maintain concubines, creating household arrangements where wives knew they were competing not just with other women for their husband's attention, but with young men who could offer forms of companionship and sexual pleasure that wives could not. This competition was particularly devastating because it was unacknowledged. Wives were expected to accept their husbands' concubines as a normal part of elite life while receiving no social support for the emotional difficulties this created. The psychological impact on Greek women was profound and underexplored. Many elite wives lived with the knowledge that their husbands preferred the company of young men to their own, that their role was primarily reproductive and social rather than emotional or sexual. This created a specific form of marital alienation that contributed to the general subordination of women in Greek society. As wives learned they could never fully satisfy their husband's desires or claim their exclusive affection, the effects on Greek children were equally complex and troubling. Boys growing up in households with male concubines learned early that sexual relationships were fundamentally about power and control rather than mutual affection and respect. They witnessed their fathers treating beautiful young men as objects for pleasure and aesthetic appreciation, internalizing models of sexuality that would shape their own relationships throughout their lives. For male children of the elite, the presence of concubines created a particularly twisted form of education about their future social roles. They learned that when they reached adulthood, they too would be expected to acquire and maintain beautiful young companions, that this was a mark of social status and cultural sophistication. But they also learned, often unconsciously, that these relationships were fundamentally different from family bonds, that the young men who shared their fathers' beds were expendable in ways that family members were not. The institution of concubinage also had profound effects on Greek attitudes toward aging and beauty. In a society where youth was literally commodified through the concubine trade, growing older became associated not just with declining physical attractiveness, but with decreasing social value. This created a culture obsessed with youth and beauty that went far beyond normal human preferences to become a fundamental organizing principle of social relationships. This obsession with youth had particularly devastating effects on Greek men as they faced their own aging. Having spent their adult years consuming the beauty and youth of concubines, many Greek men struggled with terror about their own physical decline. They had learned to associate aging with worthlessness through their treatment of concubines, and this lesson inevitably turned inward as they faced their own mortality. The political implications of widespread concubinage were equally significant. The practice created a class of men who had experienced intimate relationships with those they owned and controlled, normalizing the idea that power differences were natural and even desirable in personal relationships. This mindset inevitably influenced their approach to political relationships, making them more comfortable with hierarchies based on domination rather than mutual consent or shared interests. The systematic exploitation of vulnerable young men also created a broader cultural tolerance for the abuse of power that extended into political and economic relationships. If it was acceptable to purchase and exploit human beings for personal pleasure, it became easier to justify other forms of exploitation of workers, slaves, political subjects, or conquered peoples. The concubinage system created a moral framework that normalized the treatment of other human beings as objects for the powerful to use and discard. Perhaps most insidiously, the institution of concubinage corrupted Greek intellectual and artistic culture in ways that are still evident in how we understand ancient Greek achievements today. The philosophers who developed theories about love and beauty, the artists who created sculptures celebrating the male form, the poets who wrote about relationships between men and boys. All of these cultural productions were created within a context where the actual exploitation of young men was commonplace and accepted. This context didn't just influence Greek art and philosophy, it fundamentally shaped them. Plato's discussions of love in the Symposium weren't abstract philosophical meditations. They were reflections on practices that he and his audience participated in or witnessed regularly. Greek sculpture celebrating male beauty wasn't simply artistic appreciation. It was created within a culture that literally bought and sold that beauty. Greek poetry about relationships between older and younger men wasn't romantic idealization. It was literary processing of relationships that were fundamentally exploitative. Understanding this context forces us to reconsider how we interpret and value Greek cultural achievements. It doesn't necessarily diminish their artistic or intellectual merit, but it does require us to acknowledge that they were produced within and often reflected a system of systematic abuse. The beauty of Greek art and the sophistication of Greek philosophy emerged alongside and often in service of practices that we now recognize as profoundly immoral. Despite the systematic suppression of concubine voices and the overwhelming power of the institutions that exploited them, there is evidence that some young men found ways to resist, subvert, or escape the systems that trapped them. These acts of resistance were necessarily subtle and often came at enormous personal cost, but they represent crucial examples of human agency asserting itself even under the most oppressive circumstances. Some forms of resistance were passive but powerful. Concubines might develop illnesses, real or feigned, that made them less appealing or available to their masters. They might lose their appetites and become thin and wan, disrupting the aesthetic appeal that was central to their value. They might develop melancholy or depression so severe that their presence became emotionally draining rather than pleasurable for their owners. While these symptoms were often genuine responses to trauma rather than conscious resistance strategies, they sometimes had the effect of undermining the systems that created them. A concubine who was consistently ill or depressed might be sold, dismissed, or given different responsibilities, potentially improving his circumstances, or at least changing them in ways that offered new possibilities for autonomy. Other forms of resistance were more direct and dangerous. Some concubines attempted to escape, though the legal and social structures of Greek society made successful escape nearly impossible. A young man with no legal identity, no family connections, and no marketable skills beyond those tied to his sexual appeal had few options for independent survival. Most escape attempts ended in recapture and punishment, or in the escapee's disappearance into the criminal underworld, where survival often required even more degrading forms of exploitation. But occasionally, escape attempts succeeded, particularly when concubines managed to reach foreign territories where the masters had no legal authority. Some fled to other Greek city-states that were hostile to their masters' home cities, where they might find protection in exchange for information about their former owners' political or military activities. Others joined the crews of merchant ships, trading their knowledge of elite households for passage to distant territories where they could attempt to build new identities. The most sophisticated forms of resistance involved concubines using their positions of intimate access to powerful men for purposes beyond their master's intentions. Some became informal intelligence gatherers, collecting information about political or military plans that they could trade for their freedom or use to protect themselves or others. Others used their influence during intimate moments to shape their master's decisions in ways that served their own interests or protected other vulnerable people. The case of Marcus, whose Greek name has been lost to history, illustrates this form of strategic resistance. Serving as concubine to a prominent Athenian general, Marcus learned to time his most persuasive conversations for moments when his master was most susceptible to influence. Over several years, he convinced the general to show mercy to prisoners who might otherwise have been executed or enslaved, to promote subordinates who had shown kindness to servants and slaves, and to avoid military campaigns that would have resulted in the capture and exploitation of more young men like himself. Marcus never openly challenged the system that trapped him, and his master likely never realized that his favorite's pillow talk was systematically undermining the military policies that fed the concubine trade. But through subtle, patient influence, Marcus managed to save dozens of lives and prevent countless tragedies while protecting his own position and safety. Some concubines found ways to form clandestine networks of mutual support and information sharing. These networks were necessarily secretive and limited, but they provided crucial emotional support and practical assistance for young men who otherwise faced their circumstances in complete isolation. Concubines might share information about which masters were more or less abusive, which households offered better opportunities for education or advancement, or which political developments might affect their situations. These networks also sometimes facilitated more organized forms of resistance. During periods of political instability or military conflict, groups of concubines might coordinate their actions to take advantage of the chaos. They might provide information to opposing armies, assist in the escape of prisoners, or even sabotage their master's military or political activities. The most dramatic form of resistance was direct confrontation or violence, though this was extremely rare because the consequences were typically fatal. Historical records mention a few cases of concubines attacking or killing their masters, usually in moments of extreme desperation or as final acts of defiance before committing suicide themselves. These acts of violent resistance were almost always individual and spontaneous, rather than organized or strategic. They represented the breaking point of young men who could no longer endure their circumstances and chose to assert their humanity through acts of violence, even knowing that death would likely follow. While these incidents were tragic rather than triumphant, they served as powerful reminders that even the most oppressive systems could not completely extinguish the human capacity for resistance and self-assertion. Perhaps the most important form of resistance was simply psychological, the maintenance of inner dignity and humanity, despite circumstances designed to destroy both. Many concubines found ways to preserve some core of self-respect and autonomous identity, even while being forced to perform submission and desire. They might maintain private thoughts and feelings that their masters never accessed, cultivate internal spiritual or philosophical lives that transcended their physical circumstances, or hold on to hopes and dreams that sustained them through daily degradation. This psychological resistance was often invisible to their masters and has left little trace in historical records. but it may have been the most common and significant form of opposition to the concubinage system. By refusing to be completely broken by their circumstances, by maintaining some sense of their own worth and humanity, these young men asserted the fundamental human capacity to transcend even the most dehumanizing treatment. The institution of male concubinage in ancient Greece didn't end through sudden abolition or dramatic social revolution. Instead, it gradually faded over several centuries as changing political, economic, and cultural conditions made the practice less appealing to elite men and more difficult to maintain within evolving social structures. The rise of Rome as a dominant power in the Mediterranean region brought new legal and cultural frameworks that gradually undermined Greek concubinage practices. Roman law, while far from egalitarian, created more defined categories for different types of relationships and dependencies. The legal ambiguity that had allowed male concubines to exist in a vulnerable void between slavery and freedom became harder to maintain under Roman legal systems that demanded clearer definitions of status and rights. Roman cultural values also placed greater emphasis on marriage and family formation among the elite, making the extensive use of male concubines seem increasingly foreign and suspicious. While Romans certainly practiced various forms of sexual exploitation, their approaches were typically more institutionalized through formal slavery or more commercialized through professional prostitution. The intimate, long-term arrangements that characterized Greek concubinage fit poorly with Roman preferences for either clear legal relationships or explicit commercial transactions. Economic changes also contributed to the decline of concubinage. As Greek city-states lost their independence and became absorbed into larger empires, the wealth concentration that had supported elaborate household arrangements became less sustainable. The maintenance of male concubines required not just economic resources, but social stability and cultural continuity that became increasingly rare in the turbulent centuries following the classical period. The spread of Christianity introduced new moral frameworks that explicitly condemned many practices associated with concubinage. Early Christian teachings about sexual morality, human dignity, and the importance of marriage created cultural pressure against arrangements that treated young men as sexual objects for older men's pleasure. While Christian societies certainly developed their own forms of exploitation and abuse, the specific institution of male concubinage became increasingly incompatible with Christian moral rhetoric. However, it's important to note that the decline of formal concubinage didn't necessarily mean the end of the exploitation of young men by powerful older men. Instead, these practices often evolved into different forms, less institutionalized, but not necessarily less damaging. The disappearance of concubinage as a recognized social institution may have actually made some forms of abuse less visible and therefore harder to address. The gradual shift toward different educational systems also undermined the cultural justifications for concubinage. As formal schools and academies became more common, the argument that young men needed intimate mentorship from older men for their education became less convincing. Alternative models of education that didn't require sexual relationships made it harder to present concubinage as beneficial to the young men involved. Changes in military practices and political organization reduced some of the sources that had supplied young men for concubinage. As warfare became more professionalized and interstate relations became more regulated, the capture and enslavement of young men from defeated cities became less common. Similarly, as economic systems became more complex and social services more developed, fewer families found themselves in circumstances where selling their sons into concubinage seemed like their only option for survival. The cultural shift away from the symposium as the primary form of elite social interaction also reduced the demand for male concubines. These drinking parties, where beautiful young men served as entertainment and sexual objects, had been central to Greek social and political life. As Roman and later Byzantine cultural practices replaced Greek symposium culture, the social context that had normalized and celebrated concubinage became less central to elite life. Philosophical and intellectual developments also contributed to changing attitudes toward concubinage. While earlier Greek philosophers had often provided intellectual justification for the practice, later thinkers began developing more sophisticated understandings of human dignity and autonomy that made it harder to defend the treatment of young men as objects for others' pleasure. These intellectual shifts were gradual and often subtle, but they contributed to changing cultural attitudes that made concubinage seem increasingly problematic. The decline of concubinage was also influenced by changing demographics and social structures. As cities grew larger and more diverse, the intimate household arrangements that had characterized classical Greek life became less feasible. The social surveillance and community pressure that had helped maintain concubinage systems became harder to sustain in larger, more anonymous urban environments. However, the end of formal concubinage didn't necessarily represent moral progress in any simple sense. Many of the power dynamics and exploitative relationships that had characterized concubinage persisted in other forms. The vulnerability of young men to exploitation by older, more powerful men continued, but without the institutional frameworks that had made such relationships visible and therefore potentially subject to some forms of social regulation. In many ways, the decline of concubinage represents not the triumph of more egalitarian values, but simply the evolution of exploitative practices into forms that were better adapted to changing social and political conditions. The fundamental dynamics of power, exploitation, and sexual abuse that had characterized concubinage found new expressions in different institutions and relationships. The systematic exploitation of young men in ancient Greek concubinage may seem like a distant historical curiosity, but its patterns and psychological dynamics echo through contemporary society in ways that demand our recognition and understanding. The fundamental structures of power, vulnerability, and dehumanization that enabled concubinage haven't disappeared. They've evolved, adapted, and found new expressions in modern institutions and relationships. Today's foster care system, particularly for older children and teenagers, creates vulnerabilities remarkably similar to those that fed ancient concubinage. Young people who age out of foster care often find themselves with no family support, limited educational opportunities, and desperate need for adult guidance and resources. This vulnerability makes them targets for exploitative relationships with older individuals who offer housing, education, or career opportunities in exchange for sexual access. The psychology is strikingly similar to ancient practices. Vulnerable young people, typically between 15 and 25, who lack family protection and economic resources become dependent on older individuals who have learned to recognize and exploit their desperation. The modern versions may not be called concubinage, but the power dynamics and psychological damage are remarkably consistent. The entertainment industry provides another contemporary parallel. Young performers, models, and actors often find themselves in situations where career advancement depends on maintaining relationships with powerful older men who control access to opportunities. While these relationships may appear consensual on the surface, the extreme power imbalances and career dependencies involved create coercive dynamics that echo ancient concubinage systems. The psychological profiles of both exploiters and victims in these modern contexts mirror those we can reconstruct from ancient sources. Powerful men who have learned to identify and groom vulnerable young people. Young people who learn to perform desire and satisfaction while disconnecting from their authentic emotions. Social systems that provide intellectual and cultural justifications for fundamentally exploitative relationships. The sex trafficking industry represents perhaps the most direct contemporary parallel to ancient concubinage. Young men and boys are still bought, sold, and maintained as sexual objects for wealthy clients, often under arrangements that are presented as mutually beneficial but are fundamentally coercive. The legal ambiguities that protected ancient concubinage have modern equivalents in the complex laws surrounding prostitution, human trafficking, and sexual exploitation. But beyond these direct parallels, the ancient concubinage system reveals psychological and social patterns that appear throughout contemporary society wherever significant power imbalances exist. The military, religious institutions, educational systems, and corporate hierarchies all create contexts where vulnerable individuals can become psychologically and sometimes sexually dependent on more powerful figures who control their futures. The fundamental question that ancient concubinage poses for modern society is this: how do communities become complicit in systematic abuse while maintaining their moral self-image? The Greeks didn't see themselves as cruel or exploitative. They developed elaborate intellectual and cultural frameworks that presented their practices as sophisticated, beneficial, and even noble. They created art celebrating the beauty they were commodifying, philosophy justifying the relationships they were distorting, and social institutions normalizing the exploitation they were perpetrating. Modern societies engage in similar psychological and cultural gymnastics to justify contemporary forms of exploitation. We create legal frameworks that make certain forms of abuse difficult to prosecute. We develop cultural narratives that present exploitative relationships as beneficial to all parties involved. We produce entertainment that romanticizes power imbalances and celebrates the consumption of youth and beauty by older, more powerful individuals. The therapeutic community has only recently begun to understand the specific psychological damage created by these kinds of exploitative relationships. The concept of complex PTSD, which describes the psychological fragmentation experienced by people subjected to prolonged trauma within relationships of dependency, closely matches what we can infer about the mental health impacts experienced by ancient concubines. Understanding this historical precedent can help modern therapists, social workers, and policymakers recognize and address contemporary forms of exploitation more effectively. The psychological patterns established in ancient concubinage, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, dissociation, identity confusion, and learned helplessness appear consistently in modern survivors of long-term exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, the ancient concubinage system demonstrates how entire societies can become invested in maintaining exploitative practices through cultural, legal, and economic mechanisms that make change difficult, even when individual citizens recognize the moral problems involved. The Greeks who participated in or benefited from concubinage weren't necessarily evil people. They were people operating within systems that made exploitation seem normal, beneficial, and even virtuous. This recognition should humble our confidence in our own moral clarity and make us more suspicious of contemporary practices that seem normal and acceptable, but involve systematic power imbalances and potential for exploitation. If the Greeks, with all their intellectual sophistication and cultural achievements, could normalize such systematic abuse, what practices in our own society might future generations look back on with similar horror and bewilderment? The echo of ancient concubinage in contemporary society isn't just historical curiosity. It's a warning about the human capacity for moral blindness and systematic cruelty, disguised as civilization and sophistication. Understanding this history doesn't just help us interpret the past. It challenges us to examine our present with greater honesty and moral courage. As we reach the end of this exploration into one of ancient Greece's darkest practices, we must confront the profound tragedy of lives lived and lost in silence behind marble walls that have crumbled to dust. The young men who served as concubines in ancient Greek households were denied the right to speak for themselves during their lifetimes, and history has largely continued that silence in the millennia since their deaths. But their silence speaks volumes about the capacity of civilized societies to systematically dehumanize vulnerable people while maintaining elaborate intellectual and cultural justifications for their cruelty. The Greeks, who created some of humanity's greatest philosophical works, artistic masterpieces, and political innovations, were simultaneously participating in or benefiting from practices that reduced beautiful young men to objects for consumption and aesthetic appreciation. This paradox, the coexistence of cultural sophistication and systematic cruelty, isn't unique to ancient Greece. It represents a recurring pattern in human history, where societies develop complex moral and intellectual frameworks that somehow manage to exclude certain groups of people from full consideration as human beings, deserving of dignity and autonomy. The male concubines of ancient Greece were trapped not just by individual cruel masters, but by entire systems of law, culture, religion, and economics that conspired to make their exploitation seem natural, beneficial, and even noble. They were denied voices not through oversight or accident, but through deliberate policies designed to ensure that their experiences could never challenge the cultural narratives that justified their treatment. Yet, even in their silence, these young men demonstrated remarkable resilience and humanity. They found ways to preserve dignity under circumstances designed to destroy it. They formed connections and provided mutual support despite systems that sought to isolate them. They resisted exploitation even when resistance seemed impossible and dangerous. Some found ways to influence their circumstances and protect others, turning their positions of vulnerability into occasions for subtle but meaningful agency. Their stories, fragmented and mediated though they are, remind us that human dignity and worth exist independently of social recognition or legal protection. The young men who lived as concubines in ancient Greece were fully human, regardless of how their society chose to categorize and treat them. Their capacity for suffering, their need for connection and dignity, their dreams and fears and hopes were as real and important as those of any free citizen or honored philosopher. Understanding their experiences also forces us to reconsider our relationship to ancient Greek culture and its ongoing influence on Western civilization. We cannot simply dismiss the uncomfortable aspects of Greek society as irrelevant historical curiosities, while continuing to celebrate Greek achievements in art, philosophy, and politics. The same culture that produced the Parthenon and Plato's dialogues also systematically exploited vulnerable young men for sexual pleasure and aesthetic satisfaction. This doesn't mean we must reject all Greek cultural contributions, but it does mean we must approach them with greater sophistication and moral awareness. We must learn to hold both truths simultaneously: that Greek culture produced works of extraordinary beauty and insight, and that it was built on foundations of exploitation and systematic cruelty that we must never romanticize or excuse. The fundamental question that the concubinage system poses for modern readers is not just historical, but moral and contemporary. What practices in our own society involve the systematic exploitation of vulnerable people while being justified through cultural, legal, or intellectual frameworks that make them seem acceptable or even beneficial? If we truly want to honor the memory of the young men who suffered and died in silence behind the marble walls of ancient Greece, we must commit ourselves to recognizing and addressing contemporary forms of exploitation wherever they exist. We must develop the moral courage to look honestly at our own institutions and practices, to question cultural narratives that justify power imbalances, and to listen carefully to voices that our society might prefer to keep silent. The concubines of ancient Greece cannot speak for themselves across the centuries, but we can choose to speak for them by refusing to let their experiences be forgotten or dismissed. We can honor their humanity by acknowledging the full reality of their suffering, while also celebrating their resilience and dignity under impossible circumstances. Most importantly, we can learn from their tragedy to build societies that are genuinely committed to human dignity for all people, not just those with sufficient power to demand recognition and protection. The young men who lived as concubines in ancient Greece deserved better from their contemporaries, and they deserve better from us as we inherit and interpret their cultural legacy. Their silence was imposed by others, but our response to that silence is our choice. We can choose to continue ignoring their experiences, or we can choose to let their stories challenge and inform our understanding of both ancient and contemporary society. We can choose to see them as footnotes to more important historical narratives, or we can choose to recognize them as fully human individuals whose experiences reveal crucial truths about power, exploitation, and the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. Behind the marble walls of ancient Greece, young men lived and died in silence. But their humanity endures in our capacity to recognize their worth, acknowledge their suffering, and commit ourselves to building a world where such systematic exploitation becomes impossible rather than invisible. In remembering them, we honor not just their individual dignity but our collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable and speak for those whose voices have been silenced by systems of power and privilege. Their story is not just ancient history. It is a mirror reflecting our own moral choices and a challenge to build societies worthy of the human dignity that every person possesses, regardless of their vulnerability, beauty, or utility to others. In choosing to remember and honor these forgotten lives, we take a small but significant step toward becoming the kind of people and society that they deserve to live among, but never had the chance to experience.